Yes, this is Amy Beauvais, and my presentation is on Katharina von Bora. Katharina von Bora was born January 29th, 1499 in Lippendorf, Germany. She lived with her mother and father, who were a moderately noble family. However, after her mother died, her father remarried, and at the age of 10 in 1509, sent Katharina to live at the Cistercian cloister in Marienthron. That must have been pretty interesting for Katharina at age 10. We know nothing about her stepmother or her father after that point, so we are unsure of whether they had any children. So we can't really speculate. What we do know is that more than likely, due to the death of her mother and the father remarrying, she was sent to the convent to live and be taught and raised by the nuns there. At the age of 16, she took her vows of celibacy, more than likely based on the information that she's only known, which was to be a nun. In 1517, which would have been 2 years after Katharina takes her vow of celibacy and becomes a nun at the convent, Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the church door of Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. The 95 Theses include his reform suggestions or posts against the Catholic Church and the Pope regarding what he deemed was unfair treatment, what he deemed was incorrect in the views of God, and how people should be living their lives, including the views on marriage for the clergy and monks, nuns, preachers, any Catholic or religious leaders. He viewed that they should be allowed to marry and that God had created man and woman for holy matrimony, for the idea that they would be together, they would be husband and wife, and they would live accordingly to such. He considered celibacy to be cursed and impure, regardless of what the Catholic Church had seen as a weakness, sinful, lustful. To be married means you can't control yourself. And these are the things that Katerina was brought up knowing, and her views as she became a nun. Therefore, when Martin came in on All Saints' Eve on October 31st, 1517, she was 18 years old, and she starts hearing about how this movement and how Martin's ideas affect her. 5 years after Martin nails his theses to the church door, Katerina and 11 other nuns made their escape from the convent. The escape was helped by Luther, of course, because how else would they have escaped? They wrote letters to him and they planned this escape. They planned the escape with Leonard Cope, a 60-year-old town councilor and tradesman who was making a delivery to the convent with food items. He smuggled the nuns out. They left no clothing, no belongings, no anything, only what they had on them. And he escaped with them on Easter Eve. Another symbolism of a holiday, pretty interesting for me to hear about. You had All Saints Eve, which we know as Halloween nowadays, and now you have the escape on Easter Eve. This must have been pretty serious for them, knowing that they were going to escape. The risk was very high. Nuns escaping, risking their lives from a convent. They had written Martin for help, and the travel, we don't know exactly how far or how long it took for them to get from the convent to Torgau, um, or out of Torgau, into where Luther was. What we do know is that if they were caught, if Leonard was caught, um, the potential crime that he was committing, which was freeing, or kidnapping nuns, would cause him to potentially be executed. So he was risking his own life in order to save these nuns, and these nuns were risking really their lives as well. However, in order to be free and to have this reformed movement take hold into their life. They did arrive. Well, let's go back to that one. They did arrive to Luther. They arrived safe and sound. Three of the 12 went back to their families and were taken care of and were married therein. We don't hear from them. Nine stayed behind. Luther wrote to several of um, his parishioners, his friends, the people who supported him, looking for help on these poor souls that he had taken in order to care for them. He considered them a wretched crowd, in order to make sure that they could be looked after. He found homes for all of them to live in, or be helpers in if he did not find honorary husbands for them, which was one of his first tasks. Katharina, he did not find a husband for at first. He did find a family that she could work in, or work with and live with as a servant maid. And that is actually where she stayed until they did get married, which was 2 years later. Katharina so escapes from this monastery, goes and stays with this couple that she was able to work as a servant with, had a relationship with one man during that period, those 2 years after she escaped. She did have a romance. It's written with a gentleman named Jerome. Jerome and her were romantically involved. We do not know exactly why he did not come back. However, he did not come back to see her. He left and went back to his home where his people were. He was studying in Wittenberg, and then after he left, he never returned. She never heard from him again, although she did try to write, and she was left on her own. Martin was highly concerned for her well-being, although he himself had taken a vow of celibacy and was not going to marry. That did change. That changed June 13th of 1525. He changed that view. Katharina only said that she would marry him, or she had a second choice for marrying if Martin did not want to marry her. It ended up being in favor that Martin did end up marrying her. Several things happened that took place, um, after the Peasants' War, after his own fear of mortality and how old he was getting, feeling like he was on the verge of death. He did decide to marry Katharina, and in that he was able to take care of her. What we see in this picture is how the wedding kind of took place initially at first on June 13th with a very small group of people, not a lot. Were there. They got married at Luther's home, which was the Black Cloister in Wittenberg. A couple people were in attendance. We had somebody that performed the ceremony. Justice Jonas performed the ceremony. He was also the one that wrote that the marriage had been consummated. That must have been an interesting task. However, amongst those who were at the wedding were the couple that Katharina had been living with up until she did get married. She was their servant, so they had also attended the wedding. The wedding was, again, very small, very immediate. From what we can tell, they got married in a rush. It was very kind of like last minute, had to do it just now. And it was really kind of kept secret in this small ceremony. We do know that later, about 2 weeks later, they had a larger ceremony. Luther invited everyone, including his parents, out. The town made a big deal out of it. They had a huge procession leaving, and going to the church. The town donated venison, they donated wine casks. It was a big deal. But they did it 2 weeks after they initially got married, which was June 27th. They held the public procession, and did the marriage feast with Luther's parents and everybody else present. This became something of just a great future for both Martin and for Catherine. Catherine, as an amazing woman, took in her duty as a wife, and of course, as the woman that she was, she became the entire lord and master over their home. The Black Cloister, again, formerly the home of the Augustinian monks, all the monks had left, and Martin was left with the house. He was gifted the home, and it became more than just a home under Katharina. Martin would be preaching, he would be off, he would be anywhere, anywhere doing his reform movements, trying to bolster efforts, trying to talk to friends, anywhere he was, but he wasn't home all the time. Katharina managed the estate. She was turning the home into a boarding house for students and travelers. Some of the travelers were actually looking to hear Martin preach, and they would come and stay in their home, which probably would have been a bonus for everybody because not only were they listening to Martin Luther preach, they were actually staying where he lived. Katharina brewed beer and wine. She raised all the livestock, had a lot of pigs, had a lot of cows, cooked and used her medical knowledge to help nurse the sick or injured. She was amazing. At this time, I can only imagine what she went through in order to take care of everything. She was a highly successful matron of the house, taking care of all of the business, taking care of the finances. She took care of the money. It wasn't Martin. Martin didn't take care of the money. She took care of the money. In nowadays, I it would almost be like she was the one, we would say that she wore the pants in the family because she took care of everything. That's how I view Katerina in this position and her marriage to Martin. But what we do know is we do know that they actually had a really great partnership. Katerina and Luther, um, and they loved they loved each other. They cherished each other. They enjoyed each other's company. Uh, Martin Luther referred to her as Katie, Lord Katie. He jested and made jokes, and they were they were a couple that I don't imagine was very common at that time as far as the respect and love for each other. Katie was well versed. She was an educated woman. She had a voice of her own, and with her strong sense and her own um, her own views and how she held herself. She wasn't a timid woman. She was able to maintain these conversations with their dinner guests. She would have conversations that were religious or political conversations. She wasn't the traditional woman that would just take care of the kids or do the tending and was never heard. She wasn't the seen but not be heard kind of woman. Katie was allowed to have a voice, which was at that time amazing. And it created such a great environment for both of them. It created, I can only imagine, a great environment for the house. People loved to be around her. They came and they listened to, debates that would actually spark because of something that she said. So it wasn't, it wouldn't be unexpected to think that much of Martin Luther's success was actually in due part because he had such an amazing wife that took care of everything in the backgrounds. But she also was his confidant, and he could bounce these ideas off of her, ideas that some actually speculated were hers and not his. So there's possibly a little glimmer into their life that Katie actually helped continue the voice, Martin's voice, even past his own thinking, and was able to conjure some of these ideas that Luther was able to bring forward as a joint. So as a joint effort, and that made or would make a relationship like that much more valuable. So I see in this that you have two people that just loved and cherished each other enough, and they both were committed, and they were both in it together, in the reform movement, in the love of God together, and they weren't they weren't looking for anything else. They had 6 children in total altogether, two whom did died early. Elizabeth died the earliest. Just shortly after she was born, she died. Magdalena died at age 13, and the other four of their children did live quite a bit longer in life, um, which makes it a much more successful story for them. Martin himself passed away in 1546. He was visiting in Azelburg and did die during that visit. He was buried at Castle Church in Wittenberg on February 22nd in 1546. And the tomb can still be seen there today. He loved his wife. And for Catherine or Katharina, she was deeply, deeply saddened by the loss of her husband, aggrieved for not only herself, but for all of humanity, as this note is seen here. One of the only couple letters that can be found from Katharina's that survived, of how she can't sleep or drink or eat, knowing that she's lost her husband. Um, and that for her, that says a lot. Much of her grieving was not only for herself, but for the entire country. The plaque that we see here is of Martin Luther and can be seen at Castle Church, oddly enough, where he posted the 95 Theses so many years prior. So it is interesting how this turns around and how his reform movement changed things with the help of his wife, um, which he was able to make such a committed effort towards this movement and changed a lot of things for many people. Katharina died 6 years after Martin Luther. The passing of Katharina was, um, I would say, unexpected. However, at that time period, Martin had passed away. He had left the Black Cloister to Katharina. People, the town, the government, they did not honor Luther's will for Katharina to inherit everything herself. So she had a struggle. She had to leave. She had to sell a lot of their plantation, a lot of their belongings, and she had to leave. She left at first because of the war that was going on, and then afterwards she left again after she tried to return from after when the war was subsiding. She tried to return. The Black Plague had taken over. She was forced to flee again. During that flee, her wagon fell. Um, she fell from her wagon while trying to control the horses and sustained injuries. She died ill after she had been injured and was then buried. Her surviving children were in some of the custody of their relatives at the time. She died at an age of 53 in 1952 or in 1552. The remembrance statue you can see here is very similar to Martin Luther's. This is actually at City Church in St. Mary, at City Church St. Mary in Torgau, Saxony. This is not where Martin was buried. Katie's body was not returned to Wittenberg due to the plague that was spreading and the waging wars. It was unsafe. So at the time in 1552, when Katie did die, they did have her buried, which actually the actual grave spot of where she is buried is unknown. However, the inscription on this gravestone can be seen at City Church in Saxony, and it reads, on December 21st, 1552, Dr. Martin's Luther's blessed surviving widow, Katharina von Bora, died blissfully here. We also know, although her gravesite is unknown and she was not buried with her husband because of the plague and the war, we do know that they did later create a statue monument, which can be found outside Luther House, the old Black Cloister, now called the Luther House. This is a modern statue of Katharina von Bora at the compound. And here on the right, we have a picture of the Luther House itself, which again, new name, the Luther House, old name, the Black Cloister in Wittenberg. It's now a museum of the Reformation history where everyday life of the Luther household is on exhibit and can be seen today. The ruins of the convent in which Katharina started her, probably some of the most pivotal points in her life, are seen here. There was not a picture of the actual pre destroyed or early time convent. That I was not able to find that. However, this is an image of what we can see now, showing how the convent might have been laid out. And it would have been interesting to try and think about how they escaped, the 12 nuns on that night, on Easter Eve, that they escaped. And that is the end. Thank you.